to really set the stage. We're going to set the stage with this video. We're asking everyone to just be here, have an open mind, open ears, listen, try not to be so quick to respond to what you hear, but this will be an amazing video. It's from a therapist that works with people, and he has a talk called The Assaulted Sense of Self. So as you all are reviewing this video and listening to this speaker speak so profoundly, I want you all to think about, what age did you begin to think about yourself racially? And also just think to yourself, sort of, what reservations do you have about this training? You know, what are you hoping to hear? What are you hoping not to hear? Just want everyone to sort of be in that same space as we start the session. So I'm going to start it now. Of course, it doesn't want to play for me. Give me 1 second. All right, do something different. Give me 1 second. Sorry about this, folks, but I am solutions driven here. So here we go.
We cannot hear it. Está toda la gente de la causa.
And we are going. Gotta love technology. All right. And we are back, ready to go. All right.
That's what the assaulted sense of self is like for Black people. There's a way in which it is buttressed by a lifelong exposure to devaluation, which is what happens when one is stripped of one's dignity, where respect is denied. There's also this untold story around voicelessness and the ways in which in our life that the voices of people of color are often silenced. I find with people of color that it's hard for us in settings like this to even say white.
We've lost audio.
That we don't name it. And I understand why we don't name it. Because we have a protracted history of really awful things happening when white people get uncomfortable. And so people of color won't name whiteness. And it is rare that white people name whiteness. And so we live in two worlds. We live in worlds where we're all racially socialized, and yet it's all different, because in this world of racial socialization, we're all racially socialized, that people of color know they're racially socialized, and white people don't. And so I often ask, I do workshops, ask people of color, at what age did you begin to think about yourself racially? And it's usually around 3 or 4. And when I ask white people that question, it could be my 20s, my 30s, graduate school, my first trip to Africa, And so I'm not suggesting that's problematic, but what it does, it speaks to a divide between us, because if on the one hand, if I've been thinking about it since I was 3, and you start thinking about it at 33, it now adds perspective to why you question me about why do I always bring up race. It makes the question much more understandable when you point out that I'm obsessed with race, because I've had to live with it in a way that you haven't. And so there was a time in my life where I was always teetering on the precipice of massive reactivity. One white person said to me, "Why do you always have to speak about race? Why do you always have to bring up race? Why? I never had a good response. But now I do. I bring it up because you don't. And I solemnly swear to you, I'll bring it up less if you solemnly swear to bring it up more.
So, that video, you can find it. We'll send it to you all in the materials after, and you can look on Psychotherapy Networks, Networker online, but it was a really powerful video. And I thought it was really simple. And I see Sylvia, thank you so much for your amen in the chat. Feel free to use the chat. Feel free to let us know sort of if any of this information is resonating throughout the training. And I am going to get our PowerPoint back up so we can keep going. Give me 1 second. There we go. So let's start and do some great introductions here with everyone. So if you all don't mind, to include in the chat your name, pronouns, race, and the organization that you're with. We love to ask people this question, especially during our racial equity trainings that Homebase does, to really see who is in the room and to honor who's in the room. Again, Dr. Ken Hardy said it perfectly, in my opinion. I'll bring up race less if you swear to bring it up more. For some of us, it's always front and center because of our skin color, because of the way that we may talk. So those things that we can't really hide. So if you all can start doing that, I want to introduce you to myself formally. I am David Dirks. I'm a directing attorney with Homebase. I'm based out of the Washington, D.C. area on the land of the Piscataway people here in this area. I am originally from Los Angeles, Compton to be exact. So my family is still there. I am born and raised in LA, so I'm a California boy through and through. My wonderful co-facilitator today is Max. Max, I'm going to allow you to introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, David, and hello, everyone. My name is Max Disher, and I'm also a longtime home baser. Really excited to be working with my home community. I grew up in Redwood City, and I will also, by way of introduction, forego the chat and just say my pronouns are he, him, and my race is mixed. I'm half Black, half white, and excited to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Max.
David, sorry. I think we're still looking at the YouTube as well.
Are we? Sorry about that. Resume share. There we go. So in the chat, do enter your name, pronouns, race, organization. Thanks, Max, for modeling good behavior. My pronouns are he, him, and I am Black. I identify myself as Black African American. We have a few other home basers in the room. I'm not going to ask them to introduce themselves for time's sakes, but they are going to be helping when we do breakouts later on during this session. So Nicole McCrae Dickerson is here. I know that she is in the Bay Area, San Francisco, born and raised. Nicholas Large is here joining us as well. And Nick, I believe, is also from the Los Angeles area, but he's also living in the Bay Area as well. And I think we also have Maddie Nation. I know Maddie is from the East Coast, but I think she lives on the West Coast as well. So those are just a few folks from home base that we have in the room. If I forgot anyone, my apologies. I know that you're here, but you also know that I can't see everybody in the session. So we're going to keep this show moving right along. So I see that everyone is introducing themselves. I see Dominican, Mexican, white, Caucasian, white, Asian, Mexican. I'm looking, Asian is here, Asian and Caucasian, Native, Italian. I love it, all the identities. And that was from PRC Daniel. Nice of you to join us. I see folks say, okay, Nick, mixed race. We have a plethora of folks here today, and I'm really, again, excited to get that start this session off on the right foot. And again, we want to do that by honoring folks in the room, excuse me. So going to turn it over to Max.
Thanks, David. So let's run through some group agreements. These are challenging conversations, and we want to be mindful of each other's experiences. So with that in mind, we've got 6 group agreements for today's session. So the first is that we're going to use I statements. We're always going to speak from a personal sense of self. All right. The goal here is to get a deeper understanding amongst ourselves. We want to participate to the fullest of our ability, but also keeping in mind, don't overstretch yourself. Recognize that there is an emotional tax. There's extra labor and burden on BIPOC in the room in triggering conversations. White participants, of course, you are encouraged to deepen your understanding of the history and the present day impacts on BIPOC. Instead of invalidating someone else's story with your own spin on their experience, try instead to share your own story and your own experience. Also, please don't be afraid to respectfully challenge one another, ask questions, and please refrain from personal attacks. Much of this may come as instinct to us. I understand that in this sphere, we tend to work with a lot of very compassionate people, but we want to make sure that these things are stated overtly up front. Thanks. So for today's agenda, what we're going to do is run through a few bullets here. First, we're going to do some context setting. Then we will talk about the history of racism. This is going to be on a grander scale, talk about what it means to have built a social construct of racism. Next, we'll move on to what it means to, what the term racial bias truly means. We'll talk about racism and its ties to housing segregation, which I think is really going to tie it more directly back to the kind of work that folks in the room do on a day-to-day basis. And we'll talk about what it looks like to dismantle historical systemic and institutional norms that are creating barriers for historically marginalized populations. So that's a lot of multisyllabic terms, but we're going to basically apply the lessons learned to the work we do.
Sorry.
All right, so you might be asking yourself, or many people do ask in my experience, why is addressing racial inequity a responsibility of the homelessness response system? Well, race and ethnicity, many of us know, are very predictive of socioeconomic outcomes, and those socioeconomic outcomes, probably most importantly, include housing-related outcomes, outcomes that are going to contribute directly to homelessness and housing instability, things like wealth, health, and incarceration interactions with the justice system. So, for example, in every single state across the country, and Homebase works with many of them, Black and African American individuals, for instance, are far more likely than white individuals to experience homelessness. Some of the factors that contribute to certain races and ethnicities experiencing that disproportionality and experiencing greater barriers to stable housing. And housing and homelessness response systems should work to ensure that they are not contributing to those inequities. And I would also take it a step further to say that we shouldn't perpetuate the ones that exist currently. We should be working to identify ways to reduce those inequities, reduce those disproportionalities to the extent that we have them within our control. All right, so let's zoom in on our community. So the San Mateo County Human Services Agency, we have many of them here with us today. Welcome and thanks for joining. Through their Center on Homelessness and the COC Steering Committee, they've worked across multiple fronts, and by no means is this an exhaustive list, but this is a list of things that we have especially zoomed in on as we were preparing this training for you today. So most recent memory, they have convened a preliminary planning committee on racial equity, and that committee then commissioned the San Mateo County Racial Equity Committee. So we now have a dedicated racial equity committee in San Mateo, and I'm for one, am very proud of that. We've also partnered with Focus Strategies. I should say they partnered with Focus Strategies to produce a race equity analysis and data dashboard that highlights a lot of the disproportionality that I was just referring to across the nation. Of course, our community is no different from the rest in that regard. We suffer some pretty stark disproportionalities in this community. That analysis will be made available to you in the public folder after today's session. They have also partnered with us, Homebase, to host a two-part series of racial equity trainings this year. So welcome to part one.
Yeah, thank you very much, Max. And I just put in the chat, you know, as you go through this session with us, if you, and we'll also ask through an end of workshop survey, whether or not you all are doing any other, are there any other efforts that you all are doing, whether organizationally, individually, in San Mateo? We love to hear about them. We love to possibly reach out to you to see how things are going, how you did it. But that's information that we would love to hear from you all. So thank you for that. And again, this was just a really quick snapshot of what we know that is currently going on in San Mateo. So I'm going to break us into sort of the buildings of a social construct. So author, speaker, and scholar, and a dear friend of mine, Dante King, in his book, The 400-Year Holocaust, he really examines and discusses the relationships between the legal history of anti-Blackness and whiteness through colonialism and the United States and its impacts on present-day America. It centers anti-Blackness as the core tenet of racism in white America and amplifies its relationship to the inherent value of whiteness, i.e. white identity, white culture, white institutions. You know, Dante has done a lot of literature to really look at how anti-Blackness was created as an opposite to whiteness, to protect that whiteness. And one of the things that, you know, he examines in his book is looking at all of the legal and cultural norms, so all of the laws. One of the examples on this slide is the Virginia 1669 Casual Killing Act, which literally gave anybody the right to suspect if someone was a slave, if they were trying to catch them, that they could kill them, and that they will not be held responsible for that person's death. And, you know, many scholars have looked at and seen how that type of law created a culture, created a way of thinking for folks that do not value Black life, and that racism, especially in America, is the core tenet of it, is anti-Blackness. And as you can see by that image down low, you can actually trace the thoughts, the thought processes, the way that the lawmakers and the framers were creating laws in 1600, and how some people still take matters in their own hands and they don't value Black lives, right? So as we look into race, we know that slavery predates race. We know that race has no genetic basis. We know that a human subspecies do not exist. Skin color is really only skin deep, and race was used to justify social inequities as just natural, that by virtue of a person's race, that they are, that's the reason why they are what they are. That's the reason why they are that lot of life, or they're not lucky, or they're not doing this because they may be African American, Mexican American, or Asian. It's a very modern idea. And also color blindness will not end racism. And we got these 10 things about race from PBS Race is an Illusion, which I believe is a few-part series that really digs into the creation of race and the illusion that it's set. We also know that racism is a complex system of racial hierarchies and inequities, which include internalized, interpersonal, micro level, and structural racism at the macro level, and often understood to be a conscious sort of belief. So this slide really here just talks about the many different ways that racism steers its ugly head. Whether it is internalized racism, if I, as a Black man, when I see other Black people, I harbor these thoughts that have been ingrained and taught to me, and how that is internalized in my behaviors and my actions. You know, and I think that that's very important as we help folks who are homeless, who may be of a certain race, as we already saw, you know, the disparities nationally, and we'll look at San Mateo's as well. But it's important to identify and know the source of that internalized racism. Then you have interpersonal racism. You know, I think this is not unique at all to folks who live in and are from California, because we are a state with a huge melting pot of people, as exhibited through all of the folks that are here today. And then our cultural sort of racism, institutional and structural racism, which really applies to all of the systems. The homelessness system is also included in that as well. So these are just a few terms here that we wanted to go over with you all, just so that we all had an even playing field in reference to some of these terms. That includes white supremacy as an ideology where white people are believed to be superior to non-white people. Whiteness, white dominant culture, sorry for that typo, refers to the way that white people, their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as the standard by which all other groups are compared, and non-white persons are viewed as inferior or abnormal. Then we have tokenisms, the practice of doing something only to prevent criticism and give the appearance that people are being treated fairly or included. That comes up in a lot when we work with folks with lived experience. If we have a lived experience advisory board, how do we value people of lived experience of homelessness, who are closest to the problem, who have gone through the system as a person receiving help and assistance, and how do we value them? How do we make sure that they are included without giving just the perception that is happening? And then for white fragility, we wanted to definitely talk about this because, you know, it refers to feelings of discomfort a white person may experience when they witness discussions around racial inequity, inequality, and injustice. I'll also add here, and it's also referenced time and time again in Dante King's book, The 400-Year Holocaust, is that all races can adapt and harbor the same thoughts of white supremacy and white dominant culture norms, right? So this is just not about white people versus Black. This is about Black people harboring these issues. This is about Asian folks harboring these issues. It's about Mexican American and Latino folks or Dominican folks also harboring these issues against our own races and ethnicities, as well as others. So it is something that we've all been conditioned to do because by virtue of being a part of this culture and an American, pretty much. So this is a video that we will also share with you all, but this really talks about the fact that broader labels, how this government, when we go through intake and we talk about, what's your race and ethnicity? We ask that question because that's what the United States has created for us to check the box and for us to look and see if we have disparities. But it talks about how when we use these broader labels, they can be homogenizing. We end up removing one's cultural identity or origin and lead to a hierarchy and greater marginalization. So these identifiers can also provide, so that's the sort of negative. What we also know is these identifiers can also provide a collective identity against racism, discrimination, and othering. I worked recently with some other folks, national folks throughout the country on updating HUD's race and ethnicity data standards. And we talked about sort of, utilizing these broader labels in order to build, collective community, right? When we're thinking about voting and how to vote and how to manifest a group of people, that's another sort of benefit to this sort of labeling. But we also know that within each pan-ethnic identifier lies a diversity of cultures, traditions, and languages. So we know that even though we have Hispanic and Latino as a race and ethnicity, we know that there are many folks that fit it, that have to or feel as though that they need to select that, but that they carry with them their own individual diverse set of cultures, traditions, and languages. So we wanted to just honor that here, okay? So we'll send you that video because it's a great resource to have as well, to just learn more about how folks see themselves. It's interviews from people who identify as Native American or Native Indigenous people and Latin and Latino and Latina people. So it's a really good video listening to people that are a part of those races and our ethnicities. So gonna jump into understanding racial bias. So we went over sort of the ground level. We have a shared understanding of some key concepts and terms. If we're going really fast, I want to pause here for a little second. If we're going really fast, it's because, as you all know, we can probably spend a semester together talking about racial equity, what it is, what we should be doing about it, and all those different things. So we have a lot of content to get through. So if there's anything, again, if you have questions, put them in the chat, or also come off of mute. Go ahead and say, excuse me, David, let me ask this question, or I want clarity on something. Happy to do it that way as well, okay? So we really split this up into two parts, a sort of explicit bias and implicit. Not many folks spend a lot of time on explicit bias because it is just that. It's overt racism and racist comments, and those are sort of the examples of explicit biases. It can be positive or negative preferences for a particular group are conscious. And with explicit bias, individuals are aware of their prejudices and attitudes towards certain groups. And it's the traditional conceptualization of bias. Now, with implicit bias, we also have another video here. So we're going to stop here and play this video.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racism.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning.
Of course.
How the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an overrepresentation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem.
One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's the scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
So another great video that, I'm sorry, did someone say something? Okay. We wanted to go here, right? The video says it very clearly. That last speaker asked, do I have implicit biases? The short answer to that is yes. We all have it. We all carry them. We all harbor them, right? The key to this work on my journey to doing racial equity work, at my prior job and now here at Home Base through TA is first unlearning what I've been taught, right? So it's about being honest with oneself and looking into how you can detect these biases, how you may need to do a deeper dive in this culture's history to reveal some of these attitudes and stereotypes. So in the PowerPoint, we're not going to go through it here, but you will also, if you haven't already done so, because this resource has been around for a while, but Harvard, some Harvard, researchers created an implicit association test. And there are numerous tests that you can take. We also know that implicit biases we hold often don't align with our declared beliefs, right? We're not bad people. I'm not racist, right? That statement, I don't have these things, but really, how do you view and see other folks based on their actions, the way that they look, the way that they talk? We have to be in a position, if we're truly going to be this work and be agents of change, then we have to be in a position to check ourselves and check our own implicit biases. Any comments or questions about that? Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you. We really wanted to get you all as much good information, so it's good to see that this is resonating with some folks. All right, so wanted to also give you all some strategies that you can use, right? Your responsibility is to realize that you made an assumption, research a little or seek more information, and then don't act just on your assumption. Act on the facts and the data. You all know in this field, we are very much data driven, but we also know that we work in a human services field. This is customer service for a lot of us. These are people's feelings, these are people's lives, these are people's emotions. So remember to always don't just act on your assumptions. Remember that you have to also look into being culturally competent. For those case managers or intake workers, make sure you're aware of your own cultural groups and of their values, who you're serving in the community, making sure that you have an understanding of their values, that their assumptions, right? As a Black man, excuse me, my dog is playing with a bottle in this room as I'm trying to speak. Go away. Sorry about that, folks. But culturally competent, but we want to make sure that we check those assumptions and biases regarding the cultural groups. As a Black man, this is what I was going to say. As a Black man, you know, if I'm having a mental breakdown through an outreach engagement and the police comes, there may be some things because of my culture and how I've been indoctrinated in this country that is going to escalate that to being a very bad situation. So how can we create a better environment and understand that the effects of racism, the effects of explicit and implicit biases on folks have a real life consequence? And as service providers helping people through crisis moments, how can we make sure that we make better decisions? First and foremost, by understanding and checking ourselves. All right, moving right along. So again, we will have some more resources as it pertains to racial biases, implicit biases especially, and we're gonna talk more about that in the second session as well with everyone. So the next part of this presentation, we're gonna go into racism and housing segregation. We're looking at, you know, redlining, racially restrictive covenants, exclusionary zonings, right? And we start here with Richard Rothstein. He said, only if we can develop a broadly shared understanding of our common history will it be practical to consider steps we could take to fulfill our obligations. Again, as hard as it is, we have to realize that some of the work that we have to do requires us to just take a step back and relearn what we've learned before. This quote acknowledges that racism is embedded in every structure within society. Racism was baked into our systems and institutional practices, which is why racism still exists in our present day reality. We're looking at, you know, the history of racism and understanding the intersection of racism and housing in this country. We're looking again at racially restrictive covenants and redlining and exclusionary zonings. So when we begin to reflect on our history and progress towards racial justice and racial equity, not much really has changed. Our history's residual effects of systemic and institutional racism continues to permeate throughout communities and neighborhoods of historically marginalized populations. This is why providing you all with the historical context is necessary, okay? So the Monroe Doctrine here starts in 1823. So if you remember earlier, those Virginia slave acts were enacted in 1669. So we're looking at the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and so on. And we can look at acts, we can look at different laws to see how this absolutely has shaped the country that we lived in. So, for instance, the Monroe Doctrine proclaimed the U.S. as protector of the Western Hemisphere by forbidding European powers from colonizing additional territories in the Americas, even as the Americas, continued to build on the foundation of settler colonizing, genocide, and war. You have the Indian Removal Act. Again, that was over 100,000 Native Americans were forcibly removed from the southeastern United States and were marched over 5,000 miles spanning 9 states in what was known as the Trail of Tears. You have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, following the 2-year Mexican-American War, U.S. military force on foreign soil. California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado were all ceded to the U.S. along with parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. Again, we're talking about this in the sense that, you know, it was war. This was violence. This was terror that took this land over, right? And we have to atone for what these effects have been for the people in this country, including all of us. So we have the Dred Scott decision. Juneteenth, we know that was the Emancipation Proclamation, which became official in 1863, but not for everybody. It wouldn't be until 2.5 years later, on June 19th, 1865, that slaves in Texas learned of their freedom. I could go on and on and on, but as you can see, our history is stained with instances in which things have happened to mostly people who were not white in this country. And it was legally permissible. It stood the United States federal government, it stood the Supreme Court. And even when we were able to get laws passed to change some of these effects, we have to think about how these things created a culture, how it created a psychopathic process for people in power to continue to hold people back and to continue to harm and inflict all of that trauma on folks, okay? So you all will get this slide. A lot of this information will be in it. This is just some really quick bits of information. We have from 1916 to 68, we have institutionalized housing discrimination. Again, we talk about restrictive covenants, Federal Housing Administration and GI Bill loans, among other national and local policies. The GI Bill loan refuses home loans to Black vets. So again, this was a bill written by Congress to refuse home loans to Black vets. So think about you all hear it all the time. We talk about it, you know, generational wealth that was not attained for the men that were coming back from war, especially the Black men that fought in these wars. They just did not receive, they didn't receive the same opportunities that white army men were able to do, okay? So we also know here that we have racially restrictive covenants. A racially restrictive covenant is a legal contract imposed in deeds that restricted, back then, it was Black people, but it restricted, we saw a lot of racial covenants for not only Black people, but Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, especially Asian folks as well, in the Northwest Pacific and in the Bay Area specifically. But we also know that, you know, it says no property at any time shall be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. You know, and this language here, it's beyond just what's written, right? Think about the practices. You all know we read regulations, we interpret them all the time. So think about the acts that took place to restrict someone buying property, or what happens if someone did buy a property and a Black family gave their money and then they were probably put out on the street because it was illegal for them to purchase it in the first place. So not only were they probably stolen from, but they were sort of hoodwinked and swindled out of money, out of wealth. So we see that a lot happening in communities during this time from the 1920s, 1920 to 1948. Max, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about San Mateo.
Yeah, thanks, David. Folks, you'll notice my job is to zoom in again on San Mateo over and over. So let's talk about our community real quick in this grander context of restrictive covenants, redlining, so on, housing segregation. So early San Mateo history, we're talking about the Fair Housing Act, the FHA excluding low-income neighborhoods from its mortgage loan program. And this kind of practice was actually very commonplace around our county. So there's a fantastic New York Times article out there that'll be linked in this presentation. But in short, around World War II, we had numerous Black San Mateo County residents working in a variety of industries, benefiting from the economic boom of World War II. They were working in industries like logging, agriculture, dining, entertainment. Redwood City, in fact, had a sizable Black population surrounding its logging industry. There are hardly any of those trees left at this point, but then during and after World War II, they experienced a boom in the shipbuilding industry. And that attracted a sizable second migration of Black Americans to the region. It's thought that post-war stability in Black communities stemming from their ties to those profitable industries gave rise to the civil rights movement in San Mateo County and across the nation, right? Stable communities build stable leaders. Stable leaders paved the way for the civil rights movement. Some may have thought that that wasn't something that could stand. And in more recent decades, we saw a shift away from the federal control of low-income housing toward programs more like block grants and voucher programs, which anyone who has lived in or tried to rent in San Mateo County in recent memory knows that these kinds of programs are most effective when adequate affordable rentals exist. And the term adequate affordable rentals is probably leaving as bad a taste in your mouth as a San Mateo County resident as it leaves in mine. Fun fact, that picture you see there is David D. Bohannon. He is the racist architect of our segregated neighborhoods around the San Mateo County and the greater Bay Area. He built countless race-restricted neighborhoods all across the Bay Area and was later appointed president of the National Association of Home Builders. He was president of the Urban Land Institute and was also inducted into the California Home Building Foundation's Hall of Fame. His company continues to exist today, and that developing company still carries on his legacy, I would say, through more creative means, being that a lot of his tactics are no longer actually legal, but they've found new ways to accomplish his original mission, I would say. Thanks, David.
No, thank you, Max. Before we, any questions about any of this stuff yet? Just doing a post check with everyone here. For those of you that have the cameras on, thank you so much, because y'all are paying attention and I can tell. So I can see a few folks, but just wanted to just give space and grace for any questions that may have popped up, any thoughts that you may have. So yeah. I love this comment from Sylvia, so I'm going to read it out for everyone. Racial justice is one of the final barriers that must be overcome if America really intends to reconcile its tragic history of racial inequity and abuse. The world is watching, especially today with social media. It's so true. It's so important. And what we hoped to, no problem, Sylvia, it's all good. We know you all are busy, so that's why we try to do it in the time that we have. But what we are trying to show to everyone as well is the fact that, it's beyond policies, it's beyond having policies that make it illegal to do these things. We have to start figuring out ways to shift mindsets, right, to shift thinking around these things, because we have been taught so much about all of these sort of ways in which we were, and I'm gonna say we were because I'm a part of the group of people that were these instances were against, but we were treated. Can you please elaborate on the housing practices that continue through this company and others like them? What will we do to counter it? Absolutely. We're going to keep going through the presentation and we're going to talk about that. So thank you for that question. I don't want to say your name wrong, but I saw your question. Thank you. All right. Cool beans. Keep them coming, folks. Okay. So again, as you guys can tell, we were really focusing on 1920 to 1948. So let's go from 48 to 68, where we saw, and if you all can please, we're recording this, so if you can mute yourselves, that would be greatly appreciated. So check to see if you're muted. And if not, please mute yourselves. So again, we see now that something is happening. As you can see, 1948, 1968, you could probably imagine Jim Crow, you could probably imagine civil rights movement. So we see that these racially restrictive covenants are becoming enforceable. People are fighting back. So in 1948, in Shelley v. Kramer, racially restrictive covenants are deemed unconstitutional and ruled unenforceable, okay? So that's just an example of us getting towards the place where we are today. So redlining was a tool used by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which created residential security maps. That is in quotations on purpose. And it was color-coded, adopted by the Federal Housing Administration. So again, you have folks who were doing this, and the federal government sanctioned it to ensure white people's investment mortgages, okay? So as you can see, this is an example of Dayton, Ohio, but you have green and blue considered great investment areas, and then the FHA refused to insure mortgages in areas considered declining or marked yellow or risky, marked red. So again, and look at it, you all. Look at what's in the inner city part of Dayton, Ohio. Any cities usually start, especially back then, it was started off of a body of water. So as you can see, you're creating de-investments in certain areas based off of race. So that's what we see with redlining from 1933 to 1968. So we also know, again, as I said, it was sanctioned by the federal government. So there was an underwriting manual, which doesn't, the federal government puts out regulations on how to do underwriting, just like they put out regulations on how to provide housing for homeless people. But the manual revealed that loans could not be insured to African Americans. Like blatantly said, do not give any FHA loans to African Americans. The manual stated incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. The work that, some scholars have stated, including Dante King, who I referenced in the beginning, talks about how you have scientists, you have Ivy League professors doing studies to really put it in the public's brain that there were differences between Blacks and whites in terms of having intelligence, in terms of who can bear more pain, and all of these different things. So that same rhetoric was permeating throughout the federal government, throughout the Supreme Court and all of the federal courts. So we really had no recourse for 400 years, folks. And I hope you can see it. So as a result, as you can imagine, someone asked about, what do we see today? Communities of colors experience inequalities. You have, criminal justice bans, economic mobility, education, health, and housing. When you create redlining, you create inequities within a city, and you put people with no resources in one particular area, and you invest in the areas that are more desirable, i.e. more white. Okay. So back again to Max to talk about San Mateo.
As a longtime resident here, having grown up here, I experienced the rhetoric around this community to put San Mateo County and the Bay Area in general sometimes on a bit of a pedestal. We're a very liberal community, but our community is truly at its core no different from some of these experiences. We had redlining, we had discriminatory mortgage approval, we had structural inequities and self-segregation to a great extent across this community. Those who live here now would probably notice, as I do on an almost daily basis, that the neighborhoods closest to, most adjacent to Highway 101 are going to trend lowest income for any given town that happens to border 101. And by contrast, if you're up by 280, it's probably a higher income neighborhood. Gentrification, though, in those communities along 101 and along the Bay Shore is heaviest now as well, right? These neighborhoods are effectively being taken over, and lower income folks are being priced out. Also worth noting, there's a geographic, the word is escaping me at the moment, but there's a geological, difference between these neighborhoods. So growing up, I always remember hearing that Kaiser Hospital in Redwood City is at risk because it's built on landfill, and Sequoia Hospital is built on bedrock. So in the event of a major earthquake, we might only have one functional hospital in Redwood City. Bayshore neighborhoods are most vulnerable to flooding and earthquake damage. Many of them are built on landfill. The entire city of Foster City is practically built on landfill. And today, what we're left with is towns that have significant minority populations. Those remaining populations are largely concentrated along the more at-risk to flooding, at-risk to earthquake neighborhoods along 101 and along the Bayshore. And I would also point out that if you just take a brief look at the US Census data, the only cities in the San Mateo County that I would consider to have any significant minority population anymore would be East Palo Alto, Redwood City, South San Francisco, and Daly City. And East Palo Alto as an outlier, Black folks specifically, East Palo Alto is still 11% Black. And that is the lion's share of the Black folks left in San Mateo County from what used to be a much larger Black population several decades ago. Black folks now just make up 3.5% of Daly City, and it goes down from there. South San Francisco and Redwood City have the next largest shares of Black folks, and those are both less than 3%. Some towns and neighborhoods are very much defined by their proximity to 101. So East Palo Alto is literally the Palo Alto east of 101. And Menlo Park's Bell Haven neighborhood is one of the last affordable neighborhoods in any other city mid-peninsula. And that is also east of 101. So no mistake, don't mistake the fact that 101 was very deliberately paved to carve communities in half and separate this neighborhood from that.
Yeah, no, and that's again, we're gonna have some time really to reflect on what this all means. Sort of, what are you all seeing? We can guesstimate what we probably think is happening when it comes to where places to rent are in San Mateo. How clients view some of these areas as much as we view some of these areas, right? And we always, I hear, and I get it, but I always think about, a client doesn't want to stay over there in this particular area, right? And we have to think, and we get mad as case manager or people trying to help them, in their homelessness, say, okay, this doesn't have to be your forever home. We have to, but we got to move you in. We want to move you off the street. So what can we do to move you in? That person is adamant about not living in a specific area. One, because if it's, when redlining creates sort of the inequities that we see, right? And the number of the violence that we see, whether or not it may be drug infested, whether or not it may be a food desert, whatever the case may be, it is a reason why our clients don't want to live in certain areas, just like we don't, right? And the reasoning is not just because it's bad. The reasoning is because it was designed to be bad. Again, if you don't get anything else from this training other than David and Max and the home-based team were really trying to get me to think about the why, to think about the how it was created to be that way. Because when we understand the why and the how, then maybe we can come up with some better solutions in order to approach the problem, okay? So moving right along into this timeline, we're looking at the Fair Housing Act, and we're going to spend a lot of time with the Fair Housing Act in the next session. So this is just a really quick introduction. But in 1968, the Fair Housing Act is passed, outlawing housing discrimination. It has, however, never been fully enforced, further perpetuating segregation. With the Fair Housing Act, we have the furthering fair housing. That's sort of a rule from the fair government, how we're supposed to go about doing that. And just a little bit about the pictures on this. This is the wrong one. No, never mind. I'm going to keep going. But, you know, the reality is it's illegal to discriminate in the sale or rental housing, including against individuals seeking a mortgage or housing assistance or in other housing related activities. The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination because of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familiar status, and disability. We hear a lot from people, and I've actually given this training before to talk about how to use the Fair Housing Act, how to use the equal access rule. There are specific rules to California as well that you can't discriminate based off of sexual orientation. You can't discriminate against, I think you all may have an age, also age discrimination is illegal. It's illegal in the federal government as well in terms of fair housing, but there are, depending on the source, the federal source of income, the federal, like ESG, CLC, it does allow obviously to make for youth shelters or to allow for housing for seniors. So there are exceptions to these rules, but we really have to get to know how to use fair housing positively so that it helps us and not hinders us in our work, okay? Just looking at the chat. All right, just seeing. All right. Just wanted to make sure I'm not missing anything good while I keep going. All right, so from 1968, and we still see this, exclusionary zoning. So this is legal zoning ordinances that forbid BIPOC from purchasing and occupying property in heavily populated white residential areas. And again, the government promoted these exclusionary zoning practices as a measure to maintain high property values for white investment properties. They regulated land use, imposed restrictions for residential construction of single-family homes and commercial property. The Fair Housing Act again perpetuated class-based discrimination that kept BIPOC low-income households away from access and opportunities present in white communities. We know that in response, that zoning regulations they seem to be created to control density, protect open space, and artificially inflate housing prices, right? And that's sort of the good conversation that we need to have as homeless services providers with developers and folks that are, you know, protecting their housing investment, right? The American dream. And we have to really talk about, okay, how can we still protect value without discriminating or having a disparate impact on Black folks and Latin folks, specifically because zoning regulations limit affordability and the number of rentals for multifamily housing opportunities. I mean, that is literally the problem in California, zoning. And what and how we can provide housing for people of very low income or no income at all and what we can do for that. So we have to think differently as citizens, as participants of this government, what we need to be doing differently, okay? All right, so another good, if you all haven't read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, another great book to get. But today's residential segregation in North, South, Midwest, and West is not the unintended consequence of individual choices and of otherwise well-meaning law or regulation, but of unhidden public policy that explicitly segregated every metropolitan area in the United States. So again, you don't have to rely on me. There are numerous scholars and people that have dedicated their life's work to uncovering, unveiling the practices of this government in particular, which for all of the great things that this government is, it is equally as important to hold this government accountable and hold ourselves accountable for when we also perpetuate these things, okay? So one question for you all is, how might this quote translate? And I'm going to read it. A huge part of housing segregation is a result of government policy on public housing policy and federal housing administration that separated Black, African Americans from integrated neighborhoods. Policies of the Federal Housing Administration, which facilitated the purchase of single-family suburban homes by white working-class families, explicitly prevented Black African American families from purchasing homes in the areas of their choice. So, questions for you all. How does this history make you all feel? How do you think it has shaped the values for white people, our values of Black people, value of Asian people, values of Latinx, Latino, Latina people? How did these racist and discriminatory practices and laws craft our culture and the way of life today? So if you all have any thoughts about that, just going to allow for some silence to come, the awkward silence we made. And I put these questions in here. Disturbing and sad. Thank you, Marina. Anybody else?
I have a question. This is Ina.
Sure. Hi, Ina.
Hi, how are you, David?
Doing good.
Maybe these questions is probably Max. I just curious about the metrics or percentage of white ownership compared to other races or something in San Mateo.
Don't have that information, but I think we can probably figure out a way to look that up.
Okay.
For you. That's a good question though. We didn't focus on the ownership piece because for this training in particular, right?
Right.
Where we're focusing on trying to get people into some rental housing, some affordable housing, right? And ownership is a piece of it, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely, but that's a good question. Any other questions? So I see folks saying that they feel it's disturbed, appalling, aggravating. Me too. Just quite frankly. Confirm, always told it is me, not what it seemed, felt, angrily assured. Wow, Daryl, that's a lot. I read that statement and there's so much that comes there. Justifies ideas of racial inferiority when people see ghettos that were never invested in. I'm curious, have any of you sort of, are you hearing any of this for the first time? And please don't be embarrassed. It's a lot of stuff that I just learned in the last, like we hear this stuff, but to see it sometimes presented in a certain way is just eye-opening. So I'm wondering if this is the first time that some of you all are hearing some of this stuff. Any other questions? All right, so we are going to have breakout rooms, so stay with us, bear with us a little bit longer.
Can I add something that strikes
Sure.
me off of, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, please feel free to correct me, but Mariah, Going off of your comment, longtime San Mateo residents may recall when it was news that East Palo Alto had gotten its first bank in 35 years or so, I believe, in the late 90s. And then the flood of investment that came in the early 2000s when they built the IKEA and built the Home Depot. But prior to that, East Palo Alto was a very deliberately and long time disinvested community.
Yeah, yeah. And you gotta think why. And you talked about it a little bit, Max. You know, the fact that the architect that we highlighted a few slides back, the fact that his business is still going. Do you all think that, you know, whoever bought this business or whoever, if it's still family owned, that they just stopped thinking, that they wanted to think differently than maybe the person who started that, their grandfather, great grandfather, whoever this person may be? So again, we can have all of the policies in the world, and I do think there is a way. There it go. It's now run by, you know, Bohannon Jr. We teach our kids these things, good, bad, indifferent. So the kids are going to teach their kids. This is all created now I can't say the word, sorry. But this is all created from one generation to another. So we have to start examining a little bit more about what you did, how you did it, and what are we going to stand for now? This is why you see, and I'm not here to start a political debate or anything like that, but this is why you see all across the country, folks remember, especially in the South, taking out statues and doing all of these different things, because that legacy is still alive and well founded, and it is really, you know, it's in everything that we do. Okay, so I'm so happy to talk about this. Again, now people are really like, yep, Janet, absolutely. And we're starting to see that. So now all of these reinvestments in certain areas, again, I'm from the Compton area, so I'm familiar with Crenshaw. It's another place that is seeing a lot of investments in areas that were traditionally not done. So what are we going to do? We're going to, you know, raise property values. People can't pay their taxes. You know, things are happening, and it's happening because it's allowed to happen. It's happening because these laws are still in place, or the people that are supposed to enforce these laws haven't really changed their thought processes. Yep, I see your comment, Sylvia. Absolutely. And listen, you all keep putting stuff in the chat, because we use that to kind of figure out how do we come back to you all to help create more opportunities for us to talk through some of these things and get to some strategies as well. Okay. All right, moving along. All right, so we're going to go to present day dismantling historical, systemic, and institutional norms that create barriers for historically marginalized populations, okay? So as we know, so from 1968, really from slavery to present, mass incarceration of people of color becomes, in Michelle Alexander's words, the new Jim Crow. Creating a two-way pipeline between homelessness, jails, prisons. Sorry, you all, if you're hearing that chime. Give me one second. So from 1916 to 1980, deinstitutionalization of people in state mental hospitals and the lack of adequately scaled community-based housing and supports, as a result, we have seen an increase in homelessness, right? So again, the same policies, really at the core of all of these policies is the constant disregard, the constant degradation of BIPOC folks, Black and brown folks. and making these policies to effectually create really what they really hope to create is to completely wipe people out, right? And there is a correlation to low income or poverty and crime. Why do you think there's always an inclination to keep people low income, poverty, and crime ridden? So again, we have to be more in tune and dig a little bit deeper than to look at the surface level of any of these issues, right? It is more intentional. It is more sociopathic, psychopathic. It is the way that it has been crafted. And people literally, their jobs are to maintain the status quo. So we have to be as equally invested in divesting from that structure and from that thought process, okay? So again, and this was a question that was asked earlier too, is that how do we see some of these things manifest in our communities today? We know that landlords and real estate agents are refusing to advertise all available units in their portfolio to people of color. Not to mention if we say we're with the homelessness agency of X, Y, and Z, and we have a list of great people. They have a voucher, which is guaranteed income. The vouchers are going way above fair market rent these days, but we still don't get people who want to rent to our clients. And we think on the surface, well, it's just our clients come with a lot of stuff. If we can be honest with each other, that's what I hear people saying, right? And it's not that at all, because you can't really, it is literally folks discriminating against folks, and largely because of the skin of their color. It's not anything else. But you see them refusing housing choice vouchers, same-sex couples and transgendered folks, sexual orientation and gender status are two categories not covered explicitly by the Fair Housing Act, even though that is covered by the, oh my God, I've been talking so much, I can't think of the word, EAR, those are the acronyms in my head. I can't get
Equal access rule.
Equal access rule. Thank you very much, Max. And then we have families with children are steered toward larger apartments, which can end up costing more and being harder to find. And then if bedroom sizes are capped at 2 heartbeats per room, families with children may be prevented from seeking smaller apartments that they might find acceptable. You have adverse treatment toward people with physical and mental disabilities. You have appraisers devaluing property values for people of color, okay? So there's many different ways that this is manifesting in our communities, not to mention predatory lending practices, quoted higher loan rates because you're in a certain community or you have a certain credit score that is baseless on whether or not a person can pay. And again, we have to look and see and really dig into, even if you did everything right as a person of color, are you still going to get the higher loan rates? Are people still going to try to police your bodies? Are you still going to be looked at and approached differently? So again, for folks who try to say, well, there has to be a reason, there has to be a standard to lend money, there has to be a reason to do this, I would advise you to dig a little bit deeper, okay? I'm not going to say you're wrong. I'm just going to say, dig a little bit deeper. Going to look at the chat about a little bit while Max get ready to talk and just see. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Right.
How does this legacy manifest in San Mateo County? These practices have resulted in the disparities that I've laid out for you right here. This is pulled directly from that focus strategies report that I referred to up top at the beginning. Black folks are overrepresented in the population experiencing homelessness in our community by a factor of 9.5. So compared to Black folks' share of the overall population, 9.5 times that rate represented in the homelessness population. Factor of 3 for Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander individuals, or a factor of 5 for American Indian or Alaska Native individuals, and a factor of 2 for Hispanic or Latina OX individuals. So, important to always be aware of the historical context that lays behind our present day realities. We're talking about this is the result of a legacy of family separation, mass incarceration, income inequality, hate crime, anti-Blackness, gentrification, education inequality, health disparities, bias. Unconscious bias is going to cause each of us to instinctively categorize people and the places and the things that we associate with those people with 150 different types of biases out there. There's a lot to unpack, but practical steps to work on these biases and to recognize that we have them within us is critical in order for us to actually change the way that these systems work. So I'm a big proponent, and I argue constantly that we have to first engage in an exercise of self-reflection, confront our own inherent and unconscious biases, and work to resolve those before we can then even examine the systemic inequities with any kind of effectiveness.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to stop sharing for a little bit and bring everybody on the screen. Looks like Nick is want to remove his pen. So we're about to go into breakout rooms. We're about to ask you all just some specific questions about reflecting on your time that you spent here. We're going to spend about a good 20 to 30 minutes in breakouts, and then we're going to come back. But I did want to ask, and pardon the dog brush, that is not my hairbrush, it's my dog's brush behind me. And now I get to see what was behind me now that I'm on screen. Nonetheless, another opportunity just before we go on the breakouts. Do you all have any questions or concerns, comments, things that we didn't talk about that you hope that we talked about? Just curious about that at this present moment, given the space for question and answer time before we go into breakouts. Maria, please. You're muted.
Okay, so I was blessed that I was able to buy my little house, Mi Casa Su Casa, back in 1987. I was married in. And I remember when we were cleaning up and just moving things in, the neighbor across the street, Caucasian elderly person, knocked at the door. I opened the door. And then I said, good afternoon, can I help you? And he says, yes, I'm looking for the owners of the house. And I said, well, you're looking at one of them. My name is Maria. So, it's a very small sample of how this has been perpetuated. And it's very, very difficult. Another comment that I want to make is when we hear of affordable housing and clients, of course, jump to the opportunity. However, when we go over their income requirements, it's very disappointing in this. Then there are disillusioned as well as myself to really realize that there's no such thing as affordable housing. And then when we talk to them about possibility of looking somewhere else, going outside the county, at least in San Mateo, it's not a choice. I mean, this is where they have all their services, and why are we sending them elsewhere? So that's very disappointing, and I just want to find a solution to that. Thank you.
No, thank you for sharing and being so vulnerable. I'm pretty sure for any of the Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, Latino Asian folks, Native Hawaiian, indigenous folks on this call. We all have our own individual stories of how we have been racially profiled, discriminated against, questioned, policed, stopped in the trail of us just living our normal lives. Recently, there was a video of I think maybe two young black men clearing snow on a sidewalk, either on TikTok, Twitter, somewhere. And the white elderly neighbor came outside and put the snow back on the sidewalk because she did not want those black men helping her in her, to do that. And they did the whole neighborhood. So, just something just as simple as that, you couldn't even harness that hatred for those young men and put it to something positive instead of arguing with people in the cold to put snow back. Those incidences are traumatizing, right? They're set up for something that can happen to be far worse. The hate, the terror that goes into a lot of this, it's sketched in a lot of our heads. Racial trauma, racial PTSD is real for people, for a lot of us, right? The images that we saw all through 2020, 21, 22 are etched in our heads, and we keep being introduced to the trauma through the media, as well as the trauma of our clients that are coming to talk to us day to day. And their horror stories. To your point, Maria, about wanting to do more, for me, I have had to take the stance of, let me educate myself as much as possible about what has happened, what is currently happening, who are the people in power now that has the power to change laws, to make laws, because we have a particular mission, as homeless service providers, right? To provide housing. What are those groups of people that can help us, advocate for changes, to build more housing, to make housing cheaper, to make it more affordable? And how can we create that wave of advocacy? Because the current way is not working for us, and it's not working for our clients, and I think that there is, this country can do a lot of amazing things, with technology and, the just how we all present and come in the different ways that we show up. So we need to put some creativity towards the solutions to these problems, but we can't do it in a vacuum to where we don't understand how the history that was before us created the issues of today. So thank you so much. Marina?
Thank you. I just wanted to share, as you're talking, and this is has happened to me in the past when we're talking about this specific, we're having this specific conversation. Even that thought of what has happened to me in the past. I've been in this country for many years, like 38, 39 years. And just thinking back on the comments, the way that people made me feel, it's creating this anxiety again. And I think I overcome that, right? But it's still in me. However, unfortunately, this also happened in my country. When we look at people in a different way, and we having all those same issues because of they're indigenous, like I'm Mayan, and my background is, indigenous, and they still. I when I was learning about my own history with my parents, my family share why they end up being communist because of the way that they were treated in our own country. So this is something that is happening happens all over the world. And I'm just glad that we're having this conversation. And I just want to
Oh.
share that.
No, thank you for sharing. All right, folks, let's get ready to go in breakout rooms. We're going to spend about 15 to 20 minutes. So Max is going to go ahead and open up the breakout rooms. I think they may be open already. Oh, no, they're not open yet.
Haven't opened them yet, but yeah, when you get into your breakout room, you'll find you're there with probably about 5 or 6 other folks, and we're just inviting you. We're assigning these completely at random, and we're going to give you some questions that I'll actually drop in the chat here.
Yep, and I'm going to show them really quickly.
Yes.
So we created some breakout discussion questions, and please feel free. You know, if these are not resonating with you, we really ultimately wanted to create a safe space, an opportunity to learn something that we may not have or look at it in a different way. But the questions are, were you familiar with this history? What was surprising? We kind of asked that already. Redlining, on redlining, do you see the impacts of redlining in San Mateo County? How does that impact your clients experiencing homelessness? And on exclusionary zoning, how might exclusionary zoning policies affect low-income BIPOC households in San Mateo County? And someone really talked about this in the chat already. You know, poverty has a close relation to maybe folks committing crimes and what that cycle creates for people. You know, if you have a record, you may not be able to find housing in certain places or house with your family if you have a certain type of record. So you all started talking about a lot of this. So let's open up the breakout rooms, and we'll be back in about 15 to 20 minutes. Well, listen, the time has come for us to close this first session. But, you know, if you all have any questions, I'm not going to really focus on, unless somebody wants to share what's something new you learned today that you may not have learned in school or throughout life. I heard a lot of people saying, I've learned this before, I heard this before, but it makes me feel good that we're talking about it. So again, I'm not going to repeat anything that folks told me in the breakout rooms that I joined, but if anybody wants to take a minute or two to share, but if you have questions, you can email us at sanmateo@homebaseccc.org. We're going to be sending out a survey. Max will probably put it in the chat, but please complete the survey. We want to know what worked, what didn't. We'll be back for round 2, where we'll be talking about sort of what you can do for your clients as it pertains to, you know, fair housing issues and working with landlords. Might include some other different things specifically for BIPOC staff in this field, and how things sort of are compacted because of your own individual identity. So I'll shut up and allow you all to maybe share back with me, whoever wants to. And if not, I know we are only 3 minutes from the hour. So want to respect you all times, but would love to hear from a few folks if you do want to share. Not everybody at once. Nobody? Okay, well, it's all good. We're gonna hear you next time. But I'll share a little bit. We heard just folks talk about being appreciative that this was something that you all made time to do. So I wanted to also say how appreciative I am in this share. I want to also be appreciative to you all for staying this 2 hours with us. And if you, some people were sharing in the chat, I'm sorry. Well, I'll end at this. Thank you for appreciating what we shared with you. And thank you for sharing your perspectives, and we look forward to having a really great second session. We look forward to having more sessions with you all. So if there's any topics that you all are just wanting to talk about, whether it's engaging people with lived experience, whatever the case might be, I'm not going to throw anything out there. Just let the team know, let you all know. And again, I thank you. You all have a great rest of your Tuesday. And if there's any other questions, I'll be here for 2 minutes if anybody wants to ask any other questions. But thank you so much. Max, do you have any other closing thoughts?
I was reflecting back to the first Rothstein quote that you shared with us, and the thought of a broadly shared understanding of common history, and how much I really appreciate everybody coming together to reflect and to unify that common understanding of our common history. I think that's such a beautiful quote, and I think it really resonates with me, the idea that we all need to agree on the broken pieces of the past so that we can figure out the collective solutions to the future. Thank you.
And I do believe, I know a lot of people said that, I don't know what the solutions are for this and that. I do believe that we are more than capable in creating solutions to a lot of these issues. It's going to take, some hard work and some understanding of what not to repeat. So again, I'll leave with this. We touched the surface of a lot of this stuff because we only had 2 hours. I could have designed a training that was 3 days for us to really dig deep and for us to talk about those things of how, do we create this strategy? How do we do that? So again, you all have been really a great audience, great participants. Thank you so much. And that will conclude this first training for San Mateo County. So have a great day, everybody. Enjoy the week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye. Bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
David, this is Lori with
Bye.
the Redwood City Outreach. What you just said, I drove a school bus for 22 years, and one kid got on the bus, and I would drive kids from East Palo Alto all over the place. And one kid got on the bus and she said, "Oh, I hate history. I don't know why they're still talking about all that old stuff." And I said, "Do you realize the importance of history?" I said, "We have to recognize and acknowledge all the things in history in order to prevent the bad things from happening again and fostering any good things that were in the past, or to make a better future." And she's like, "Oh wow, I didn't think of it that way." But yeah, what you were saying.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Lori.
No, thank you for the education. It's always nice to get education. I appreciate you guys.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, folks.
All right. Well, I am going to bow out and take a quick breather before another call.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Thank you, folks. Maria, Daryl, Richard, did you all have some questions for me? I'm happy to stay on. You can stop the recording, Max, and if you can make me the host, that might be okay.
No, I just